Pier number 15, 5:52 a.m. A body slammed against the dock, eyes open, lungs full of river. Vincent Romano had walked into a crowded ballroom 3 days earlier and humiliated Bumpy Johnson's wife in front of 200 people. Bumpy said nothing, buttoned his jacket, left, to understand what really happened in those 3 silent days. We go back to the moment Bumpy Johnson stared across that room and made his decision. Pier 15th, February 14th, 1950. The East River smelled like rust, rotting wood, and something else that morning, something copper and thick that coated the back of your throat and refused to leave. Detective Mulligan had worked waterfront homicides for 19 years. He knew that smell the way a butcher knows the smell of a cutting room. It was the smell of a body that had been in cold water long enough to swell, but not long enough to sink permanently. Vincent Romano was floating face up with his arms spread wide, like a man taking his final rest in a bathtub the size of a river. His $400 Italian suit had gone completely black with river water. His gold pinky ring was still on his finger, catching the pale morning light. Whoever had put him there hadn't taken anything. They hadn't needed to. This wasn't robbery. This was a statement delivered in the only language that certain men truly understand. Mulligan crouched at the edge of the dock and stared at Romano's face for a long time without speaking. The eyes were open, not glazed, not empty, wide open and fixed upward, locked on something just above the waterline that no living person could see. Whatever Romano had understood in his final conscious seconds, he had understood it too late to change a single thing about what was happening to him. The medical examiner arrived 20 minutes later, snapped on his rubber gloves, and pressed 2 fingers into Romano's waterlogged neck out of professional habit rather than any real hope. He didn't take long. "Both lungs completely full," he said, without looking up from the body. "Wrist bruising consistent with someone holding his arms down, same on the ankles. This man was conscious and fighting when he went under. Whoever did this held him down with their bare hands and kept him there until the river finished the job for them. This wasn't a drowning. This was execution that used water instead of a bullet." Mulligan said nothing. He kept staring at those wide-open eyes and thought this wasn't rage. Rage is messy. This was discipline. This was patience. This was someone who had made a decision and carried it out without a single wasted movement. No bullet wound, no knife cut, no skull fracture, just water, 2 strong hands, and the absolute certainty that nobody was coming to interrupt. The scene was so clean it bordered on elegant. The kind of clean that requires planning, requires time, and requires the complete confidence that comes from knowing your position is unassailable. Mulligan stood up slowly, capped his pen, and made a decision that violated every investigative protocol he had followed for nearly 2 decades. He was not going back to the precinct to file paperwork. He was going to Harlem. Curtis Barbershop on 131st Street had occupied the same corner since 1938. The hand-painted sign in the window had faded to almost nothing. The leather chairs were cracked and patched with electrical tape. The place smelled like pomade, bay rum, and the particular warm closeness of a room where serious men had said serious things for a very long time. A room where the walls had absorbed more truth than most courtrooms ever heard. Mulligan walked in without his badge showing and sat in the waiting chair. Curtis was working on a customer, an older man getting a straight razor shave, jaw tilted back, throat exposed, completely still. Curtis moved the blade in long, deliberate strokes, scraping white foam away in clean lines, not acknowledging Mulligan's presence in any visible way. 11 minutes passed in total silence. Mulligan counted every one of them. When the customer finally left, Curtis set his razor down on the white towel beside the chair and turned to face Mulligan with the unhurried calm of a man who had already fully understood this visit before it began. "Detective," he said, in a voice so steady and quiet it felt like a hand pressed flat against your sternum. "I'll save us both a lot of time. In Harlem, we don't sit around asking who did the killing. We ask what the dead man did to make it necessary. You want answers? Start with the right question. What Mulligan pieced together that morning came from a 2-paragraph police report and the kind of collective silence that, in certain neighborhoods, has always been more accurate than anything said under oath. Mulligan felt the room compress around him. He had interviewed mob bosses, corrupt politicians, and men who had ordered killings the way other men ordered lunch. None of them had stopped him cold the way this barber just had, with one sentence and no expression whatsoever. "I'm not here to arrest anyone," Mulligan said carefully. "I just need something I can write on a piece of paper." Curtis picked up his razor and began cleaning the blade against the white towel, each stroke slow and deliberate. "Then write this," Curtis said. Romano walked into a room full of witnesses, said something to the wrong man's wife that he had absolutely no right to say, and then spent 3 days walking around this neighborhood like consequences were something that happened to other people. "What you pulled out of that river this morning isn't a mystery, Detective. It's arithmetic." Mulligan drove back to Manhattan with the windows down despite the February cold. The case file on Romano would eventually read cause of death: drowning, manner, undetermined. 3 words that said everything by saying nothing at all. Some deaths don't need to be solved. They need to be accepted. And every person in Harlem who knew anything had already accepted this one completely before Mulligan's car had cleared the block. Savoy Ballroom on a Thursday night in February smelled like perfume, gin, and cigarette smoke layered so thick you could almost chew it. The band was playing hard trumpet, screaming over the rhythm section, bass drum hitting your chest like a fist, the whole room vibrating with the specific electricity of 200 people who understood they were somewhere that mattered. This was Harlem operating at full power, and at the corner table under the low amber light, Bumpy Johnson sat with his wife Mamie and looked like a man who owned everything within his eyeline because in every way that counted, he did. Mamie wore a deep red dress that evening. She was laughing at something a friend had said, her hand resting on the white tablecloth, completely at ease, completely herself. She was not a decoration and she was not a symbol. She was the one person in Bumpy Johnson's life around whom the armor came entirely off, and every serious person in that ballroom understood that fact without needing to be told. The way you understand heat without being told what fire is. Vincent Romano came through the front entrance at 10:47 p.m. like a man kicking a door open. He had 2 men behind him, thick-necked, dead-eyed muscle whose only job was to make a statement about how little Romano feared the room he was walking into. He scanned the ballroom in 3 flat seconds, located Bumpy's table, and moved toward it without slowing, without being invited, without performing even the minimum theater of basic human courtesy. He pulled out a chair and dropped into it like a man sitting at his own kitchen table after a long day. 50%. Romano said. No greeting, no preamble. 2 words dropped on the table like a blade. Every number you run north of 110th Street, starting next month, half comes to us. That's the new structure going forward. He delivered it the way a bored man reads a utility bill flat, certain, already thinking about something else entirely. One of his men lit a cigarette without asking anyone's permission, and the smoke drifted directly across Mamie's face in a slow, deliberate curl. Bumpy Johnson looked at Romano for a long, completely motionless moment, not with anger, not with surprise, with something colder and heavier than both the specific stillness of a man hearing something so far beneath a reasonable response that he is genuinely deciding whether it deserves one at all. Then he said one single word: no. Quiet as a door closing on an empty room, final as concrete. Romano's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to his 2 men and back to Bumpy in less than a second. He had expected negotiation, resistance, A counteroffer, the normal back-and-forth choreography of men who respect each other's capacity for violence. What he had not expected was boredom. Bumpy's refusal had the energy of a man swatting a fly, and Romano felt it land on him in front of his own soldiers like an open-handed slap across the face. He needed to reassert himself immediately. He needed the room to remember who he was and what he represented. And in that desperate, small, catastrophically stupid need for dominance, he turned his eyes directly to Bumpy Johnson. What Romano said next lasted no longer than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that would echo through Harlem for the next 30 years. He looked at Mamie, at her red dress, at her face, at the effortless dignity she carried, and he said, loud enough for the 4 nearest tables to hear every single syllable with complete clarity. Honestly, Bumpy, I genuinely do not understand what a man in your position sees in a woman like that. She is ugly. Everybody in this room can see it. You could do a hell of a lot better, and you know it. The trumpet kept playing, but something in the room stopped, not sound, not movement, but something invisible and load-bearing, like the moment a structural beam cracks before a building comes down. A stillness moved through the ballroom table by table, spreading outward from Romano's words like a shockwave through still water, until 200 people were holding the exact same breath at the exact same moment. Every eye in the room moved to Bumpy Johnson's face. Bumpy stood up. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket with 2 fingers. One motion, slow and precise, like a man who has all the time in the world because time is no longer the thing he is managing. He reached down and took Mamie's hand, not grabbing, not pulling, simply offering his palm the way you offer something irreplaceable to someone who deserves it completely. He looked at Romano one final time with an expression that contained absolutely nothing. No rage, no humiliation, no visible emotion of any kind. Then he walked his wife out of Savoy Ballroom without saying a single word to anyone. Romano laughed. He picked up Bumpy's unfinished drink, leaned back in the chair, and looked around the room like a man waiting for applause after a performance. No recording exists of what Romano said at that table, only the memory of 200 people who told the same story, in the same order, with the same words, for 30 years straight without ever being asked. The room did not applaud. The room did not laugh with him. 200 people looked at Vincent Romano with the specific, heavy disgust reserved for a man who has crossed a limb so fundamental that the air itself changes quality in the room around him. Romano thought he had won. The room was not keeping score. The room was keeping record. And in Harlem in 1950, being recorded for the wrong reason was not a social consequence. It was a terminal one. Friday morning. Harlem woke up holding its breath. Not loudly. Harlem never did anything loudly when the stakes were genuinely real. But the tension was physical. The way cold is physical before you step outside and feel it present in your back teeth and the base of your skull before you can name what's causing it. The numbers runners felt it on their morning routes. The card game operators felt it when they unlocked their back doors. The women who ran the informal intelligence networks that kept the neighborhood economically alive felt it before their first cup of coffee had finished brewing. Something fundamental had shifted the night before at Savoy Ballroom, and the shift had a name that nobody needed to say out loud. Romano felt nothing. Friday morning he ate eggs, sausage, and toast at his usual table in Little Italy, told the story of the ballroom to 4 different men over the course of the meal, and laughed louder with each retelling the expansive, satisfied laugh of a man who mistakes the complete absence of immediate retaliation for permanent, unconditional safety. He had walked into Bumpy Johnson's territory, sat at his table uninvited, demanded half his operation, called his wife ugly to her face in front of 200 witnesses, and walked back out with both legs functioning perfectly. In Romano's understanding of how power operates, that sequence of events meant one thing: he had won completely. Bumpy was finished. The 50% was already effectively his. This specific misunderstanding, this fatal, irreversible misreading of silence as surrender was the thing that put Romano's bloated body against the dock pilings at Pier 15 3 days later. Romano was interpreting Bumpy's stillness as weakness. He did not understand, had never understood, and would die without ever understanding that Bumpy Johnson's silence was not the absence of a response. It was the response in its most controlled, most dangerous, and most final form. The silence of a man who has already decided, is already moving, and sees absolutely no reason to let you know about it until the outcome is locked and irreversible. Bumpy Johnson did not touch a single weapon during those 72 hours. He touched a telephone. Over 3 days he made 11 calls to a lawyer on 125th Street, whose practice covered problems that never appeared in any courthouse filing. To 2 numbers, runners whose networks reached across neighborhood boundaries into territory that connected Harlem directly to downtown Manhattan power structures. To a minister whose confession booth had absorbed information that would make career criminals go pale. And to 3 women in Harlem whose combined operational knowledge of who was doing what for whom and why was sharper and more current than anything sitting in a police intelligence file anywhere in New York City. He was not planning violence. He was conducting research, methodical, patient, completely invisible research that separated a man who reacts from a man who controls outcomes. By Saturday evening, the research had returned one single fact that completely transformed the shape of everything. Romano had no authorization from anyone, not from the Genovese family, not from any senior figure, not from any meeting that had ever taken place. He had walked into Savoy Ballroom on raw, personal arrogance, fueled by greed and the catastrophically dangerous delusion that his Italian surname functioned as a blank check he could cash in any neighborhood in New York City without consequence. He was freelancing, and in the rigid, hierarchical world of organized crime, freelancing against an established operator's territory without organizational backing is not boldness. It is a man digging his own grave with his bare hands and calling it ambition while he works. That single fact changed everything. If the Genovese organization had ordered the move against Bumpy's operations, any response meant open war, bloody, prolonged, financially devastating to Harlem and catastrophic for everyone operating on both sides of the arrangement. But Romano had acted entirely alone, without authorization, without protection, without anyone senior willing to stand behind what he had done. Which meant removing him was not an act of aggression against an organized family. It was a correction, a maintenance issue, the kind of quiet, professional adjustment that serious men on both sides of any working arrangement could recognize as necessary without anyone losing money, losing face, or losing sleep over it. No plan was ever written down. No order ever documented. What remains is only the outcome. And outcomes this clean, this contained, and this completely free of organizational blowback do not happen by accident, any more than a surgeon's incision happens by accident. Bumpy Johnson made his decision the way an experienced accountant closes a bad ledger at the end of a difficult quarter, without sentiment, without ceremony, with complete and total focus on what the numbers required. Romano had overextended himself beyond his authorization, beyond his institutional protection, and beyond the one boundary that cannot be crossed in any world built on reputation as its primary currency. He had attempted to use another man's wife as a public weapon, in front of 200 witnesses, to demonstrate that the man no longer had real power to protect what mattered most to him. If Bumpy left that unanswered, every ambitious and undisciplined operator from the Bronx to Brooklyn would read it as an open invitation to test the identical boundary themselves. The 3 days were not hesitation. The 3 days were a door being locked from the inside, quietly and without ceremony, so that when it finally opened again on the 3rd night, the man standing on the wrong side of it had absolutely nowhere left to go. Mulligan went back to Harlem on Saturday morning with cold coffee, an empty notebook, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who already knows he will never solve the case in front of him. He had asked 6 people in 24 hours who killed Vincent Romano. 6 people had given him the same response, not hostility, not fear, but a patient, almost gentle blankness, like a man asking why the sky is blue and expecting a different answer each time. He sat at a corner table in a diner on Lenox Avenue and stared out the window at the street. The place smelled like burned bacon grease, strong coffee, and the specific warmth of a room full of people who all know something the man by the window does not. A man in a gray coat dropped into the booth across from Mulligan at 9:14 a.m. without asking permission. Small, thin wrists, nervous hands that never stopped moving, touching the edge of the table, pulling back, touching again, like a man whose fingers had been trained by years of careful survival to stay ready for anything. He smelled like cigarette smoke, cold February air, and something chemical underneath both the smell of back rooms and decisions that leave no paper trail. He looked at Mulligan's coffee cup, decided against it, and spoke in a voice so low that Mulligan had to push his entire body forward across the table just to catch the words. You want to understand why Romano is dead. You need to understand one thing first. Respect in this neighborhood is not a feeling. It is money, hard money, the same as cash in your hand, the same as gold sitting in a safe. And when someone attacks your money publicly in front of 200 people, you cannot let it go. Not because of pride, because the second you let it go, every single person who watched it happen starts spending against you. They start testing you. They start taking. And when that starts, detective, it does not stop until there is nothing left of you worth taking. Mulligan kept his pen flat on the table. He said carefully, "So Romano died because he insulted a woman in public." The man in the gray coat made a sound short, sharp, cold, not a laugh, but something that carried the specific contempt of a man hearing a profound stupidity stated with complete confidence. He leaned forward until Mulligan could smell the stale smoke on his breath and said, "Romano did not die because he called Bumpy's wife ugly. Romano died because he stood up in front of 200 witnesses and tried to make the whole room watch Bumpy Johnson get destroyed publicly and do absolutely nothing about it. That is not an insult. That is a demolition job." Romano was not trying to take 50% of the numbers operation. He was trying to take the one thing worth more than all of it combined, the belief. The shared belief, held simultaneously in 200 people's heads. That Bumpy Johnson is a man whose family you do not touch and whose silence you should be genuinely afraid of. Destroy that belief in public, and the entire operation collapses on its own. You don't need to fire a single shot. Mulligan felt it then, the specific shift inside a man's chest when a complicated picture collapses into something simple and so brutal it has almost physical weight. He was trying to destroy Bumpy's credibility, Mulligan said. In public. Permanently. The man in the gray coat looked at him for the first time without checking the door. "Now," he said quietly, "you are asking the right question." He stood up, buttoned his coat without rushing, and walked out of the diner without looking back, leaving Mulligan alone with cold coffee and the sick clarity of a man who now understood everything about why Romano had to die and nothing whatsoever about who had carried it out. Nobody who sat in that diner booth ever gave a name, signed a statement, or repeated under oath what was said that morning, and the version of events assembled here comes entirely from the story Harlem chose to tell itself, which is not the same thing as a confession, but has always been more reliable than one. Power is not a weapon. Power is not money in a safe. Power is a story held alive in other people's minds, and it dies the moment the man at the center of it absorbs a public humiliation and does nothing. Romano had tried to kill that story in front of 200 witnesses, with music playing and gin on the tables, and then walked away laughing. The exchange rate on that kind of attack has only one denomination. It has never, in the history of that neighborhood, been paid in anything else. The restaurant on Mulberry Street had no sign above the door and did not need one. The private room in the back smelled like garlic, tobacco smoke, and old wood, the smell of a room where serious men had been making irreversible decisions for a very long time, where the walls had absorbed more genuine power than most government buildings in the city. 6 men sat around the table. 2 chairs were left deliberately empty. Nobody explained why. Nobody needed to. Frank Costello arrived last, as he always did. He took off his overcoat, sat at the head of the table, and looked slowly around the room at 5 faces watching him with the focused patience of men who had learned long ago that the first person to speak in a room like this usually ends up defending a position they did not intend to take. Costello picked up the glass of red wine already poured at his place, looked at it, set it back down without drinking, and said 4 words in a voice so flat and final they landed in the room like a blade dropped on a stone floor. Romano was not authorized. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the muffled noise from the restaurant beyond the closed-door cutlery scraping plates. Low voices. Someone laughing at something completely ordinary in the front room. Sounds so normal they felt obscene given what was being decided 8 feet away. Then the heaviest man at the table, gray at the temples. Permanently exhausted eyes, said, "We have a reputation to think about. Romano goes into Bumpy's territory, gets handled, and we sit here saying nothing. Every operator in New York reads that as permission. We look like we cannot protect our own people." He said it without heat, the way an accountant presents a deficit, factual, direct. No emotional decoration whatsoever. Costello looked at him for a long moment without any expression at all. Then he said, "Romano was not our people. Romano was a man who walked into someone else's established territory without telling anyone at this table. He made demands he had no authorization to make. He humiliated a man's wife in front of 200 people. He spent 3 days walking around New York like consequences were something that happened to other men. He did all of that alone, no instruction from us, no blessing, no support from anyone in this room. He freelanced. He failed. And freelancers absorb their own losses. We have never covered a freelancer's losses. We will not start tonight." Costello finally picked up his wine and drank from it slowly, the way a man drinks when a decision has already been made and the only thing left is to let the room catch up to it. The heavy man looked at the table for a long moment, then looked back up, then nodded once, a single, small, clean movement that contained within it the complete and total abandonment of Vincent Romano by every person and institution that might conceivably have stood up for him. "As far as this organization is concerned," Costello said, setting his glass down with a quiet click, "Romano made his own choices and walked into his own end. He is not in our books. He has never been in our books. We are done saying his name. No minutes were taken at that meeting. No record of any kind was ever produced, and the only evidence that the conversation happened at all is the absolute silence that followed. Not one man connected to the Genovese organization raised his voice, made a phone call, or took a single visible step toward answering what happened to Romano, which in that world speaks louder than any transcript ever could. Vincent Romano died twice in February 1950. He died the first time in the East River, both lungs bursting with cold black water, his $400 suit dragging him toward the bottom like a hand pulling him down. He died the second time in that back room on Mulberry Street, when the men who ran his world looked at each other over a dinner table and decided, without raising their voices, that his name was no longer worth the breath required to say it. The first death took his body. The second death took everything else. In that world, dying violently at minimum means you mattered enough to someone to be worth killing. Being erased from the books entirely means something far worse. It means you never counted at all. Saturday evening, Vincent Romano ate veal, bread, and 2 glasses of Barolo at his regular table, loud, expansive, filling the room with his voice the way a man does when he has decided, against all available evidence, that he has already won. The restaurant smelled like tomato sauce, garlic, candle wax, and warm bodies packed close together. Romano sat in the middle of all of it like a man who believed the warmth was specifically generated for him. He told the Savoy ballroom story 3 more times that evening to 3 different audiences. Each retelling was louder than the last. He acted out the moment he said the word ugly directly to Bumpy Johnson's face. He demonstrated with his hands how Bumpy had stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without a word. He laughed at the end each time, a full, chest-deep laugh that bounced off the walls and made other diners look over and smile without knowing what they were smiling at. He dismissed his bodyguards at 10:30 p.m. with a single wave of his hand, the wave of a man who has convinced himself that precautions are for people who have something to fear. One guard, a thick-necked man named Caruso who had survived 4 years working for Romano by reading rooms correctly, started to object. Romano cut him off with a flat, dead stare that turned the objection to ash before it became a full sentence. "I am going for a walk. I do not need company for a walk. Go home." Caruso and the other guard exchanged a look over Romano's shoulder as he reached for his coat. It was a long look, the kind that passes between 2 men who both know something is wrong, and both know that saying it out loud will change nothing. Neither spoke. They watched Romano walk out the front door into the February cold. Then they stood there for a moment in the smell of garlic and old smoke. Then they went home. They spent the rest of their lives knowing they went home. Romano walked north. The cold hit his face immediately, sharp and flat, like an open hand swung hard, the kind of cold that makes your eyes water before you have taken 3 steps. The sidewalk smelled like frozen concrete, exhaust, and the faint metallic edge of river air that drifts through lower Manhattan on cold nights when the wind comes from the east. His leather soles cracked against the pavement with every step sharp, clean reports in the silence, announcing his position to the empty street with the confidence of a man who does not believe the street is listening. The black Cadillac was parked at the curb 2 blocks north with its headlights completely off. Romano saw it from half a block away and slowed. He was not a stupid man. He had lived long enough in a world of dark cars and quiet streets to feel, somewhere below conscious thought, what a car sitting cold and lightless on an empty block at 10:45 at night was likely to mean. He stopped 10 feet from the car. He looked north. He looked south. Nothing moved anywhere. No sound except his own breath turning white in front of his face and the distant, unreachable noise of the city on other streets. The rear door opened from the inside, not swinging wide, just opening enough. A controlled and deliberate gap that communicated total certainty more effectively than any gun pointed at his face could have. From inside the darkness of the car, a voice said, "Get in, Vincent." Calm. No urgency. No theater. Just the flat, heavy calm of a man who has already stopped thinking about this as a situation with more than one possible outcome. Romano stood on the sidewalk and looked at that open door for 15 seconds. 15 seconds is a very long time when you are standing alone on a dark street in February, and a car you do not recognize has just called you by your first name. Then he got in. The door closed behind him with a single clean click. Not a crash. Not a slam. Just a click. The quiet mechanical sound of something being sealed away from the world outside permanently. Nobody on that block heard a raised voice. Nobody heard a struggle or a shout or any sound that did not belong to the ordinary noise of a car leaving a parking spot on a winter night. The Cadillac pulled smoothly into the street, headlights coming on at the corner, turned, and was gone. What happened inside that car has never been described by anyone with direct knowledge of it, and attempting to reconstruct those hours from anything other than silence would be the same as inventing them. So what remains is only the end point. Confirmed at 1:47 a.m. when Romano's body entered the East River at a location that told investigators everything about where the story finished and nothing at all about what it contained. Romano had spent 3 days telling everyone within earshot how completely he had won. He had spent those same 3 days walking through a city that had already finished counting what he owed and sent the collection. A man that drunk on the sound of his own laughter cannot hear what is moving quietly and with total patience in the dark directly behind him. The river was 34 degrees. The current was strong. By 1:47 a.m., Vincent Romano was not a man anymore. He was a settled account closed, balanced, and filed away where no detective's notebook was ever going to find it. Mulligan sat at his desk on Monday morning with the Romano file open in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. The office smelled like cigarette smoke, burned paper, and the particular staleness of a building where too many unsolvable problems had been carried in through the front door and quietly buried. He had 3 pages of notes. He had 0 usable witnesses. He had a medical examiner's report describing in cold clinical language exactly how 2 human hands had held Vincent Romano underwater until his body stopped fighting, and not a single name anywhere in the file connected to those hands. He had spent 48 hours making calls and knocking on doors. Every door gave him the same thing, the flat, patient look of people who had collectively decided that a specific question did not exist and therefore could not be answered. 2 people hung up on him. One man laughed, not nervously, genuinely. The warm, relaxed laugh of someone who finds the entire premise of the inquiry almost charming in its innocence. Mulligan picked up his pen and looked at the blank line on the official form where manner of death was supposed to be recorded. He thought about Curtis in the barber shop and the specific gravity of that sentence: "We don't ask who did the killing. We ask what the dead man did." He thought about the man in the gray coat and the exchange rate of respect in a neighborhood where respect functions the same as hard cash. He thought about a black Cadillac with its lights off and a door opening from the inside and a voice saying, "Get in." Vincent, with the calm of a man who has already stopped thinking about the outcome as a variable. Then he wrote 2 words, "undetermined." He capped his pen. He closed the file. He picked up his cold coffee and drank it anyway, and moved on to the next case on his desk. The official record of Vincent Romano's death reads 4 lines. Cause of death: drowning. Manner undetermined. Investigating officer Detective J. Mulligan. Case status open. 4 lines. 11 seconds to read from top to bottom. It contains the complete and total story of everything the city of New York officially chose to preserve about what happened to Vincent Romano. And what a city chooses to preserve about a man like Romano has always been determined, less by what the evidence showed, and more by what the people responsible for writing it down decided the city needed to know. Which is not always the same thing as what actually happened. Mulligan requested follow-up interviews with 3 witnesses the following week. All 3 declined through lawyers. The letters were polite. The message underneath the politeness was the same message he had been receiving since he pulled Romano's bloated body from the water. This is finished. It has always been finished. And the sooner you accept that, the better for everyone in the room, including you. He filed the denial letters in the Romano folder. He put the folder in the cabinet. He locked the cabinet. He did not open it again for 6 years. When he finally did. In 1956, he read through his 3 pages of notes and felt the same thing he had felt sitting in Curtis's barbershop on that February morning. Not frustration, not anger, but a cold and deeply uncomfortable recognition of just how completely a thing can be sealed when everyone with knowledge of it makes the same quiet decision simultaneously without anyone giving the order out loud. Because the truth about Romano was never hidden. Hidden things can be found with enough time, enough pressure, enough people asking the right questions. Romano's truth was not hidden. It was agreed upon. Silently. Collectively. Permanently. Agreed upon by every person with real knowledge of it, to the effect that it required no discussion, no acknowledgement, no record beyond 4 lines in a city file that nobody who actually understood what had happened was ever going to read and find surprising. The case stayed officially open for 11 years. In 1961, it was reclassified as inactive due to absence of new evidence. The file currently occupies approximately 1 inch of space in a municipal archive in Lower Manhattan. The truth of what happened occupies considerably more than that in the memory of Harlem. In the operational understanding of every serious person who worked in New York organized crime in the years that followed. In the collective and unspoken knowledge that functioned as a standing instruction to anyone who needed to understand where the lines were. Truth. This thoroughly agreed upon does not need to be spoken. It does not need to be written. It simply exists the way gravity exists, invisibly and constantly, with complete indifference to whether anyone chooses to acknowledge it out loud or not. 3 weeks after Romano's body came out of the East River, a man came to Harlem from Little Italy. He came alone, no muscle, no escort, no performance of force, which was itself a statement louder than anything he was going to say when he arrived. A man who comes alone to a meeting like this one is communicating, before he opens his mouth, that he respects the person he is coming to see enough not to insult them with theater. He walked up 4 flights of stairs in a building on 128th Street, his leather soles loud on the bare wood steps, the stairwell smelling like old cooking grease, paint, and cold air bleeding through a window that didn't close properly at the 2nd floor landing. He knocked on the door at the top. Bumpy Johnson opened it himself. No bodyguard in the hallway, no intermediary standing between them, just Bumpy, in shirt sleeves. Looking at the man from Little Italy, the way a man looks at someone he has been expecting for exactly as long as he expected to wait. Not surprised, not particularly interested, simply present and completely still. He stepped back from the door without speaking and let the man in. The apartment smelled like fresh coffee, cigarette smoke, and the faint trace of Mamie's perfume still hanging in the air from earlier that morning. 2 chairs had been placed near the window facing each other, no table between them, no surface for papers or props, nothing to put anything down on. Just 2 chairs and whatever the 2 men chose to say out loud. The man from Little Italy sat. Bumpy sat across from him, outside the window. 128th Street moved through its ordinary morning layered voices. A car horn 2 blocks east. Someone's radio bleeding through the wall below them. The sounds of a neighborhood that had already absorbed what happened to Romano and moved cleanly forward. The man from Little Italy said, "What happened to Romano was Romano's own doing. Every serious person on our side has accepted that completely and without reservation. Nobody is coming for you. Nobody is coming for your people, your operation, or anyone connected to you in any capacity. The arrangements that existed before that evening at the ballroom continue exactly as they were. That is the message I was sent here to deliver, and I have now delivered it." He said it the way a man reads a prepared statement clean. Complete. No personal feeling layered on top of the words. Bumpy looked at him. The silence in the room lasted long enough that the man from Little Italy became aware of his own breathing and the faint sound of the radio 2 floors below. Then Bumpy said, "I appreciate you coming here in person. That means something real, and I want you to know I recognize it for exactly what it is." He paused. When he continued, his voice was the same temperature, the same volume, the same complete absence of heat or performance, but something in the room changed. The way a room changes when a door is locked from the inside without any visible movement. I need to be clear about one thing, because clarity serves both of us better than anything else we could leave this room with today. I do not operate on warnings. I do not factor warnings into my decisions. What Romano received took 3 days because I needed to confirm the facts before I moved. Next time, if there is a next time, the facts will already be established. There will not be 3 days. There will not be 1 day. There will not be any time at all between the moment I understand what is happening and the moment it is handled. The man from Little Italy held Bumpy's eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the clean, single nod of a man who has heard every word and will repeat every word exactly as spoken to the people who need to hear it. He stood up. He put his coat on slowly. He said, "I don't believe there will be a next time," Bumpy said. "Good. Then we understand each other completely, and we are finished here." The man walked out the door and down 4 flights of stairs and back downtown, and the arrangements between Harlem and the Italian organizations continued without interruption from that morning forward. No recording of what was said in that room has ever surfaced, and no written account from either man exists, but the content of that conversation declared itself through the behavior of every person senior enough to have been told about it, each of them quietly adjusting their conduct in the months that followed without being asked even once. Real power does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice. It is visible only in its effect in the way other people correct themselves before they are required to. From the spring of 1950 forward, not one person connected to any Italian organization in New York moved against Bumpy Johnson's family or his operation without full authorization from the very top, because every person who needed to understand what happened to the last man who moved without that authorization had now understood it completely, permanently, and without any need for a reminder. The first Thursday Bumpy Johnson came back to Savoy Ballroom. The band started at 8 o'clock sharp. The room filled the way it always filled, slowly at first, then suddenly all at once, the way pressure builds invisibly before something gives way. The air smelled like perfume layered over cigarette smoke, layered over gin, and the warm closeness of 200 people packed into a space built for 150. Everyone dressed sharp. Everyone aware, without anyone having announced it directly, that tonight carried a weight that ordinary Thursdays did not. Word had moved through Harlem the way it always moves when something important needs to be communicated without being officially communicated person to person. In low voices, through the specific shorthand of a neighborhood that has been talking to itself in careful language for generations. By 7:30, every person walking through the front door of Savoy Ballroom knew that Bumpy and Mamie Johnson were going to be at their regular table. Every single one of them had already made a private and conscious decision about how they were going to conduct themselves when that happened. Bumpy and Mamie arrived at 8:15. Bumpy wore a dark suit and a white shirt. Mamie wore blue, not the red dress from that February evening. A different one. A choice that nobody in the room was going to ask about, and everybody noticed at the same moment. They walked in together, Bumpy's hand at the small of Mamie's back, moving through the crowd the way water moves through a space that opens for it naturally, unhurried, completely at ease. 2 people who had walked into this room 100 times and intended to walk into it 100 more. They reached their table. They sat down. A waiter appeared before they had fully settled, standing with the specific attentiveness of a man who understands that this particular table matters more than any other table in the room tonight. Bumpy ordered without looking at the menu. Mamie laughed at something her friend said, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of a woman sitting exactly where she intends to be. Then something moved through Savoy Ballroom that has no precise name. Not in the music the band kept playing, Not in the noise level the room stayed loud, but in the quality of the air itself. The way air changes when a pressure system shifts. A settling, a collective release. 200 people simultaneously and silently agreeing, without eye contact or spoken word, that the natural order of things had been confirmed and restored and required no further commentary from anyone. Men who had been scanning the room stopped scanning. Conversations running at slightly lower volume than usual returned to full strength. The trumpet player hit a note with more force behind it than anything in the previous set. The room breathed out and became fully itself again. Nobody stared at Bumpy's table too long. Nobody approached without being invited. Nobody made a joke about anyone's wife or family or anything that touched the personal. Not because anyone enforced it. Not because a visible consequence waited at the door. Because the shared memory of 200 people who had been present in this room on a specific February evening was operating exactly as shared memory operates when it has been written deep enough silently, automatically, requiring no maintenance and no reminder. Later that night, after the third set, Mamie leaned close to Bumpy and said something in a voice too low for the nearest tables to catch. Bumpy listened without moving. He was still for a moment in the way he was still when he was thinking about something he had already thought about completely. Then he answered her a few words. Quiet. Delivered with the specific, unhurried calm of a man for whom this particular question has been so thoroughly examined that producing the answer requires nothing from him at all. What passed between them exists only in the understanding of people close enough to observe without hearing, and the private words of two people who have carried what they have carried together are often more accurately understood through the silence surrounding them than through anything that could be placed on a record, which is the nature of the conversations that matter most and get written down least. What the nearest tables understood from watching was this. Mamie had asked whether another man would eventually come and try what Romano had tried, and Bumpy had told her yes because there will always be men who decide the lesson was specific to Romano, who convince themselves they are smarter or better protected or operating under different circumstances. And the lesson, Bumpy told her, does not change. It has never changed for any man who needed to learn it. The answer is the same every single time, regardless of how confident a man sounds at dinner the night before. Savoy stayed open until 2 in the morning. The band played past their scheduled finish because nobody wanted to be the first one to leave. When Bumpy and Mamie finally stood up to go, the room shifted one final time, that same invisible collective recalibration, like a gyroscope finding its center and holding. Order in Harlem was never written in any law. It was never enforced by any court. It lived in rooms like this one, in the memory of everyone present, requiring no maintenance because it was written in something far more durable than paper in what 200 people had seen and heard and felt on a February evening, and would carry with them, without being asked to and without ever needing to be reminded why, for the rest of their lives. Romano surfaced, then vanished. Bumpy never celebrated, never announced a thing. He just kept Harlem standing. Little Italy kept making money. Police kept filing reports. Jazz kept playing at Savoy every Thursday like nothing happened because officially, nothing did. But after February 1950, every serious person in New York understood one unwritten law: do not make a powerful man's family your stage. Do not make his wife your weapon. Because the man who buttons his jacket and walks out without a word is not retreating. He is loading. 3 days. No gun. No witness. No trace. Just a body with both lungs full of river. When someone humiliates you publicly, do you explode and give them exactly what they wanted? Or do you go cold, go quiet, and finish it your way? Tell me in the comments. And if this story hit you, subscribe. Because the next one makes this look like a warm-up. The most dangerous thing was never the gun. It was always the patience behind it.